like to call us to order at 5:05. And we'll start with our roll call. Terry Andrews.
Here.
Ira Bushey.
Here.
Betsy Kahn, I'm here. Gwendoline Mullins.
Here.
Armando Zambrano. Okay. 3A, Public Communications. Mark, would you like to start?
Mark Mariscal, public comment. So one, there's a new sheriff in town, literally a new sheriff in town. And so he cleaned house. Thought that was kind of interesting that he took all the non-civil servants and moved them all out. I don't know if that's good or bad or different from Altadena, but I would suggest that our library director and or our board president send a nice thank you letter congratulating him and just asking that anytime in the future that he'd like to come and say something, I think he should reach out because it's always a good PR move. Next week's agenda for next Monday, I would like to ask, I was going to send an email, I just haven't gotten to it, but that if it's possible to take the support groups and move them up earlier in the agenda, we're going to invite the members of the foundation and the friends to come here and do a check presentation. So if you could do that, we would appreciate it instead of it being later. Christmas Tree Lane is this Saturday, and so the friends have a book sale, so we encourage everyone to come out starting at 2 o'clock. So just like to share that. And I think that's enough for now, but thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Renee.
Thank you, and happy Hanukkah to everyone here. It's great to be here on a day that's a celebration of miracles, wonders, and reestablishing faith within a community and a tradition that's been going on for millennia now. Not so much here at the library, apparently, where apparently the Christian version of holiday events sort of rules. Something you might want to look at. Lots of Christian information and decorations up and out, and nothing related to any of the other faiths that I could see today, which I found kind of unusual. But in front of all of you board members, at the suggestion of an Israeli friend of mine, there's some gelt, Hanukkah gelt. This is play money. This is real shiny, it's gold colored, Star of David on one side, maybe both sides. And it's nice and it's chocolate. It's very enjoyable, it's very sweet, it's very tasty, and it's used by kids to play with the dreidels. And my friend, after I described some of the goings-on here at the library district, suggested that it would be an appropriate memento on Hanukkah for the board members because of the way you folks have been spending money and also spending goodwill of the community. Here tonight we have a very surprisingly large turnout for a meeting that had almost no public notice, that wasn't mentioned at the end of last week's last week. Last week was a regular, that's right. There's so many meetings going on that it's hard to keep track of them all for any members of the public. But this meeting wasn't explained prior to the notice being published last week. Anyway, the short story long is, nobody really knows why we're here. And as we spend all this money, I would urge you to consider this gelt. And every time you decide to bring in an attorney from BB&K or another organization, think about this and think how easy it is to spend this money by eating it, and at the same time spend taxpayers' money by paying these attorneys. Thank you.
Mark, 4A or B? No, 4A or B is what I'm asking.
Oh, it's A.
Thank you. Okay, we've reached 4A, our item of new business, which shortly will be a report from our attorneys, Best and Krieger, represented tonight by Christine Wood. She is going to give a very detailed presentation, and because what's in the presentation may evoke questions, for this particular item of business, we're going to offer the opportunity for another round of public comment after she's done, so that anything that comes up for you during the course of the presentation that she gives that elicits a comment from you or a question from you, you'll have that opportunity afterwards, and be assured that questions that might come up in your mind as she's giving her presentation, you will have the chance to pose those questions after she's done, and then she will have the opportunity to answer those. So rest assured that time is built in for you to clarify anything that is not clear. So I think maybe what we should do, guys, is just turn ourselves around so that we can also see the screen.
Is there an opportunity to comment prior to?
As I just explained, the opportunity will be after. On the one agenda item, you'll have the opportunity to comment after.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Becky. And good evening. So as Betsy mentioned, my name is Christine Wood. I'm an attorney at Best and Krieger. I'm also the Assistant General Counsel for the Altadena Library District, and have been proudly representing the district since May of this year. Today's presentation will be relatively brief considering the gravity of the subject that I'm here to discuss. The goal of the presentation is to present a report of the board's compliance with the Brown Act. But I thought it was helpful to present a brief overview of the Brown Act, just to provide a context for the report. So I will start by giving a review of the Brown Act very briefly. This isn't a training. I'm not going to cover every aspect or provision of the Brown Act that I would cover if I was doing a training, but I think it's important to kind of lay a context for what I'm going to discuss. I'm going to give an overview of how the alleged Brown Act violations came to light. We'll talk, actually give a report and some findings, and then illustrate some of the violations. And then we'll, as Betsy mentioned, we'll leave room for public comment, and if there's questions afterwards, I will address as many questions as I can. Okay, so the Brown Act is one of California's 2 sunshine laws, which is a term that refers to a state's commitment to allowing the public, or allowing the sun to shine on how the government operates. So one of the sunshine laws in California is the Brown Act, and it governs public business and public meetings. Every state in the nation, including DC as well as the federal government, has sunshine laws. And so the Brown Act is just California's version of the sunshine law that addresses public meetings. Its companion law that addresses public records is the Public Records Act, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the Brown Act hasn't changed very much since it was enacted in 1953, except that in 2004, the provisions of the Brown Act were enshrined in the California Constitution through Prop 59. So now the rights that are within the Brown Act for the public are constitutional rights. The Brown Act applies to local agencies, cities, counties, and special districts, including districts like the Library District. It doesn't apply to state agencies, but there are there's another identical law that applies to state agencies and governs their meetings. The purpose of the Brown Act is to ensure that almost all aspects of the decision-making process of any legislative body is done in the open, and so that the public has an opportunity to participate, scrutinize, and observe. So of course, legislative bodies has to be defined in order for that to be the goal. So legislative bodies are defined as any board, commission, or committee which is created by a local governing body, including permanent, temporary, advisory, or decision-making committees. And examples of that obviously are city councils, boards of supervisors, governing boards of water districts. But just remember, don't get caught up in the legalese. Basically, a legislative body would be broadly defined to include just about any type of decision-making body of a local agency. So one point I'd like to make now, because I think is important as I talk later about corrective actions and some of the things the district can and started to do differently, is that the Brown Act is really a floor. It's not a ceiling, right? So the provisions that I'm going to discuss are ways that, or tools that a legislative body or a local agency can use to facilitate the business of a local government. Local agencies can create policies that are provide for more transparency than the Brown Act provides for. So the Brown Act is not at all a ceiling. It's definitely a floor. It provides you some guidance. So this quote provides you the essence of what the Brown Act is meant to do. It states that all meetings of the legislative body of a local agency shall be open and public, and all persons shall be permitted to attend any meeting of the legislative body of a local agency except as otherwise provided for in this chapter. And that really speaks to what you see happen here all the time. There are a lot of things that happen within these meetings that are really born within the Brown Act, and you just see them illustrated at various points within the meeting. So sometimes the Brown Act has so many provisions and people can get kind of lost. And so a lot of times when I do Brown Act trainings, I present this kind of checklist to help people understand when the Brown Act applies. So first you ask yourself a question, is the body a legislative body, and if so, the Brown Act then applies. You then ask yourself, is the gathering a meeting? Because even though the Brown Act may apply, it may not be a meeting. So if there is a meeting, then the meeting must be open and it must be public. And has adequate notice been provided of the meeting? And if not, then no formal actions can be taken. And if any formal actions are taken, then the actions are null and void. So first and foremost, it's important to determine whether a governing body is engaged in a meeting, because all meetings of the governing body of a local agency need to be open and they need to be public. So there's a legal definition of a meeting. So the legal definition of a meeting is that a meeting is any gathering of a majority of the members of the legislative body when they're gathered to hear, discuss, deliberate, or take any action on any item or matter under their jurisdiction. So it's not necessarily required that they take action. If they are there to hear, discuss, or deliberate on any matter under their jurisdiction, then it's a meeting. So obviously, as you do here, if you have a 5-member body and 3 persons are present, then you have a majority of the body present, and therefore whatever is happening, if it involves a matter under their jurisdiction, then you're within the confines of a meeting. So what's not a meeting? So within the Brown Act, they still want to let government happen and lobbying happen and lobbying with a lowercase l, but they still want constituents to be able to access their electeds. So there's individual contacts allowed between members and between the members and the public. So obviously if you go and have a one-on-one conversation with a member of the board, that's not a meeting necessarily. There can be an opportunity where, before I even go into all these exceptions, remember that the exceptions are there to allow for the precise things that I'm describing. The exceptions are not there to be used to circumvent the Brown Act and create a meeting using these exceptions. So, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how that works, but you can't necessarily have individual meetings with members of the body and then eventually get to a place where you've had enough individual meetings that you end up having consensus among the body, and therefore you've ultimately had a meeting. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. But individual contacts between members and between the members and the public are fine. Obviously, members of a legislative body can attend conferences and seminars, as long as they don't, again, refute the purpose of this exception and then have discussions amongst themselves about things that are under their subject matter jurisdiction. They can attend community meetings, and rightfully should. They should attend social or ceremonial occasions. They can attend standing committee meetings. If they're not a member of the standing committee meeting, however, they need to attend as an observer. And they can meet with other legislative bodies. So these are not meetings such that the Brown Act would necessarily apply, meaning it doesn't have to be noticed. One of the most frequently asked questions about the Brown Act involves serial meetings. And this is also where many of the violations to the Brown Act are going to occur, especially in this day and age of electronics. So serial meetings are meetings that at any one time involve only a portion of the legislative body, but eventually involves a majority, and that's expressly prohibited within the Brown Act. Serial meetings can happen through the use of like an intermediary, they can happen through technological devices, or they can happen through direct communication. As long as there's a collective concurrence created, meaning you're actively advancing or clarifying an issue, or you're trying to get ultimate resolution of an issue. If you're working in some kind of way, either through a hub and spoke, which is the first kind of image up there, or if you're working through a daisy chain, you are committing Brown Act violations through serial meetings. So the hub and spoke, the first little image, is like when there's one person who then goes out and talks to multiple people to find out what the consensus is, or to build consensus, or to get people to start making decisions outside of the viewpoint of the public. In that hub and spoke example, you'd be having serial meetings. So if one person went out to find out how is member A going to vote on this, and how is member B going to vote on this, and they're sharing that information to come up with a conclusion or a concurrence, then they've committed a Brown Act violation. Or if they participate by member A talking to member B, and then member B talking to member C, and they never really talk to each other, but they've shared enough information so that they know what's going to happen, or they've been able to determine a decision that way, then they created a daisy chain communication. That's very easy to do in today's age with emails, text messages, even blogs. The courts have even ruled that Facebook posts and likes are communications, such that if they happen with elected officials, they could generate Brown Act violations depending on the content of those social media posts. It's very easy to do, and it's become much more cumbersome as emails and social media have become more prevalent. So again, serial meetings can happen through in-person meetings, they can happen through telephone conversations, emails, obviously written correspondence, the use of intermediaries, as I talked about, and social media networking sites. There are exceptions. Obviously, one-on-one communications with a staff member of the legislative body, as long as that staff member doesn't share what other board members or other council members might be thinking, as long as they're doing one-way communications with each of the board members, those are acceptable meetings. Or communications that have to happen in order to schedule a special meeting. So those are times when you can have communications across the entire majority of the board without considering, without violating the Brown Act and having a serial meeting. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to cover, those were really important things to cover because of the types of violations that occurred, but I'm not going to cover all details. I just wanted to point out a few other key provisions of the Brown Act. So meeting agendas obviously must be posted prior to a meeting in order for the public to have notice and the ability to attend. For regular meetings, it must be at least 72 hours prior. For special meetings, 24 hours prior. At your regular meetings through public comment, you have to give the public a right to participate and address the body. No action or discussion is allowed for any item not listed on the agenda except under specific circumstances. Going back to the public comment, it's important that you recognize that a legislative body has the ability to regulate public comment. In this particular instance, public comment is regulated by allowing just 3 minutes of time. As long as it's fair and it's not viewpoint specific, you have the ability to regulate public comment. And then finally, Closed sessions are authorized for specific topics, but they must be noticed, they must be briefly described in the agenda, and a report out may be required if an action is taken. And just to point out, there are a few closed session topics that may be relevant to the business of this particular district: real property transactions, existing anticipated litigation, personnel issues, labor negotiations, grand jury subpoena possibly, or threats to public services of facilities. So with that review of the Brown Act done, it'll be easier to discuss some of the context of the alleged Brown Act violations and our findings. So, of the Brown Act violations that have been alleged, most if not all of them can be sorted into one of these 6 categories. First, improper closed session descriptions on meeting agendas, improper reporting out following closed sessions, failure to hold a public vote following closed session, board action on an item posted as informational, improper limitations on public comment, and serial meetings among board members. Many of these categories of violations are debatable, and some we contend are unfounded. And since the litigation related to some of these allegations is still pending, I will limit my findings to the one area where there is no doubt that the Brown Act violations occurred, and that is in category 6, where there were serial meetings among board members. Inherent in this violation is a secondary consideration about the use of personal email accounts by the board. So many of you may know that in March 2017, the California Supreme Court decided the San Jose case, which requires public employees and by extension elected officials to provide otherwise public records in response to a PRA request. Remember, PRA requests, remember back to what I described in terms of the 2 sunshine laws, the Public Records Act and the Brown Act. So even if the record is kept on the employee's or the elected official's personal device, like a text on a personal cell, or in their personal email account, like an elected official's Gmail account, the record must be disclosed. As of the beginning of this calendar year, the board had not been completely briefed on the impact of this ruling from March 2017.
Excuse me, we're trying to listen.
Well, excuse me.
Thank you.
I
However,
can't help myself from
the board had actively used their personal email accounts until late 2017. And so these were some of the findings as it related to the use of the personal email accounts in the San Jose case. Any public employee's communication about official agency business is subject to the Public Records Act, regardless of the device or the account that transmits the communication. When it comes to personal devices, employees should search their own devices for records that are responsive to a request. And then after proper training on how to distinguish what is a public versus a private record, those employees are able to then identify public records and produce them. They do have the option of asking for assistance from the public agency, but the court was really careful to want to make sure that public officials and public employees have their rights protected, their privacy rights. And so they have the ability to search their own devices. They don't have to turn over their devices or turn over their email accounts. But they should be trained on how to distinguish what is a public versus a private record. And that comes straight from the decision. And employees will need to be prepared to sign affidavits that they've conducted adequate searches and produced the responsive records. And so at this point, unfortunately, and especially because there's been so much effort right now handling the current litigation that's facing the district, we've not completely even conducted the training that's necessary for the public employees and the board to properly know how to identify what's a public and a private record. And I still don't believe that the board has been completely briefed on the San Jose case and all the things that are required of them. But it was definitely an issue at play as the Brown Act violations were occurring. So again, remembering back to the beginning of the presentation when I referenced the sunshine laws, one of the ways these 2 laws work together is for the public to use the PRA to request public records as a way to monitor the activities of a public agency and as a way to scrutinize decisions and activities of the agency staff. That's how how they work together. So if there is a Brown Act violation to be uncovered, quite typically people are going to uncover it through the production of records in response to a Public Records Act request. So why is that important here? It's important because since our firm was retained by the district in May of 2017, we've handled over 30 PRA requests for the district, and nearly all but 1 or 2 of them were either from Dale Gronemeyer or Renee Amy, and we've produced over 5,000 pages of public records in response to these requests. This is notable because I have been told that the district typically only receives about 3 to 5 PRA requests a year. So this meant that the district was now responding to 5 or 6 times the number of requests it would normally receive. And when you couple that with the district's lack of understanding of the San Jose decision related to personal email accounts, these requests required a great deal of attention. So in this context, several of the 20 requests from Mr. Gronemeyer were used by him to find evidence of the Brown Act violations that he has alleged. So these are summaries of those requests and the records that were produced to Mr. Gronemeyer that demonstrated the serial meetings that I discussed earlier. Therefore, as part of the district's attempt to remove any cloak of secrecy and to make sure that not only Mr. Gronemeyer but everyone has access to these records, all of the public records that were produced in response to these 6 public records requests have already been posted on the district's website under the public documents section. So specifically, these requests sought the following records. So PRA request number 2 sought records from former trustee McDonald that he had permanently deleted from his district trash folder on or after January 19th, 2018. Notably, it was later revealed that none of those emails were actually permanently deleted from McDonald's email account, as evidenced by the fact that we were able to retrieve them and produce them, but that was the way the request was worded, so I'm presenting it to you that way. PRA request number 7, all emails from February 26, 2018 to March 26, 2018, in which one or more board members are either senders or recipients of the emails, and in which any way refer to or concern the district, its board, or Ms. Kate. PRA request number 8, all emails that relate to the district and trustee Brashatsky has had a personal email account at any time from February 2017 to May 2018. And you'll see in parentheses at the end of those the number of, and I apologize if this is incorrect, it's 123 pages, not 123 records. So 123 pages were produced in response to request number 2, 1,005 pages were produced in response to number 7, and 2,211 records were produced in response to number 8. In response to PRA request number 9, which asked for all emails that related to the district that former trustee McDonald had in his personal email account at any time from February 2017 to May 2018, we produced over 1,600 pages. In response to PRA request number 11, there was a search for emails between trustee Zambrano and former trustee McDonald as it related to Dave Herman and some emails that had been exchanged between Zambrano and Herman, and there were only 9 pages of records in response to that PRA request. And then PRA request number 16, which looked for the agenda of a meeting that took place on August 17, 2017 at the Loma Alta Park Community Center. That was a special meeting and it was posted on the district website, and so the request was to actually get those records to make sure that
You can hold your question till after Renee, please.
to make sure that the Brown Act was followed in its provisions. And so the request was for the agenda for the board meeting, the notice that was required to be posted on the website for that meeting, the minutes of that board meeting, and all emails that refer to that board meeting, except for those that had been previously produced to the requester. And there were 11 pages of records that were produced in response to that request. So, since we did our initial review of the Brown Act allegations, Just to be clear, Mr. Gronemeyer has also issued a PRA request number 20, targeting the personal email account of trustee McMullins. On November 29th, we produced our first set of those records, which were a total of 1,162 pages, but we've yet to complete that production, and that production will also be uploaded to the district's website when it's been completed. So we've reviewed, over the course of making those productions, obviously we've had to produce those 5,000 plus pages of records and determine the following about the alleged Brown Act violations. So there were serial meetings that were prevalent over the course of the entire time frame covered by the PRA request, which started as early as February 2017. Second, the violations are steeped in an incomplete understanding of the Brown Act. And I think that can be really attributed to both staff and to the board members, and I'll talk about that in more detail. There appears to be a lack of intention by the board members to hide things from the public, and you'll see that in the illustrations I'm going to show you, where Brown Act violations were committed while they were saying in the email context, let's do this to avoid a Brown Act violation. There was just really a misunderstanding of how the provisions of the act worked. Often the violations were attempts by the board to manage district operations or to participate in some aspect of the district's operations. And with proper guidance, there were some simple corrective actions that the staff and the board could have taken, and some of those we've already started to take within the district. So, again, serial meetings were prevalent over the course of the entire time frame. If you decide to review the records that have been produced on the website, the serial meetings were taking place at the earliest date of the records production, which again goes back to February 2017. They were likely taking place even prior to that, because as I will discuss further, this appeared to be kind of common practice for the Board of Trustees. It seemingly was based on expediency and convenience. Regardless of why, the violations were prevalent, as I'll illustrate in the next few slides. So the violations were steeped also in an incomplete understanding of the Brown Act by both staff and board members. So this comes from, I wanted to show some of these because I think it's important to note how you'll be looking for these records on the district's website. So down here is the source of this particular record. It's PRA number 8, as I mentioned to you before, and this is page 11 in the production. This email is from Ms. Kate when she was director of the district, and it was to the board. It's a very simple, it's a very simple email, and all she's doing in the email is trying to provide answers to questions that were posed in a prior meeting that was held on July 24th, 2017. So this email was sent to the entire board, and then there was subsequent communication about this particular email. And so it was sent to the entire board plus the district's HR consultants. So you see that here. Board members are listed here. The consultants are listed here. You see that it's from Ms. Kate, and then you see the dates that it's sent and the attachment. And she's just giving them some information. It's not problematic if there's no communication back, right? So if there's no deliberation about this, this is not in and of itself a private email. I'm sorry, a problematic email. But what it does do by leaving the board members purposely copied is that, or purposely listed in the to line, is that it inadvertently could potentially facilitate a Brown Act violation. And we saw that happening frequently from either staff or from a board member. One of the things that we've started to do now, that the board has already done with corrections, is instead of communicating this way when it's a one-way communication where all the board members are listed, we've now started to communicate with the board members with blind copies so that there's no way for them to reply all, and there's no way for us to inadvertently create or facilitate Brown Act violations. This is another example of a little bit of a misunderstanding of how the Brown Act works. So this is an email from Ms. Kate to Trustee Brashatsky. It's dated August 2017, so a little bit earlier in the in the emails as opposed to some of the 2018 emails. And it says, unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess it depends on how you look at it, the law does not allow the board to vote on anything in closed session. Well, that's inaccurate. The board is allowed to report on things in closed session as long as they report out on those reportable items. So again, it's just these aren't malicious attempts to violate the Brown Act. It's just a misunderstanding of how the Brown Act operates. Here's another illustration of that. So this is an email from Trustee Zambrano with CCs to the entire board as well as staff. It's from former Trustee McDonald. It's dated in January of 2018. And so one of the things he's saying here is sorry. So down below in the earlier email, he's saying specify what you're in agreement with. Do you agree that Mindy, do you agree with Mindy that the board is not entitled to copies of incident reports? And so, and then there's a response here. This is from Trustee Zambrano to former Trustee McDonald. And then in the response, Trustee Zambrano says that he's not agreeing that we should discuss the construction of the agenda as a group, that could lead to discussion and debate and be deemed as a Brown Act violation, though it's a good question to ask during our training next week, because they were all going to attend a Brown Act training. But by the virtue of sending this email and having this discussion, they're already violating the Brown Act. Do you see? So there's several iterations throughout the records where you'll see that there were already violations happening contemporaneous with their attempts to try and avoid the Brown Act violations, which again speaks, in our opinion, in our findings, it speaks to the intent. And this again is sourced at PRA number 9, page number 394. To our next finding, there also, again, appears to be a lack of intent by the board to necessarily hide things from the public. So here's an example from Ms. Kate. It's dated in August 2017 to the entire board, and the subject is the possible closure of the branch. This is an email about the AC going out, I think, in the branch. And of course, obviously in August, this is hot, this is great information to have, it's important, she wanted to share the information. Again, this is simply remedied by a blind CC to the board as opposed to an active CC. But one of the things that's interesting here is that she's updating them and then she's telling them we'll keep the board and staff and the public through our website, signage, and Facebook social media pages notified. Again, this is not an attempt to try and hide anything from the public. And there were other examples of this type of communication where it was just information being shared. Here's another illustration. So I'm getting much smaller, so I'm sorry, I'm sure you guys can't see it. So this is PRA number 9, and you can see this at page 361. This is an email from Ms. Kate to the board members, and this is another great example of them just trying to operate in a way that was probably a little bit more detailed than they needed to as a board. But Ms. Kate was sending them some information about a proposed fence that was being proposed by a neighbor to the branch. And this is to Ms. Kate from former Trustee McDonald, talking about the fence and the wall and the property line and the survey. It's just a great amount of detail as it relates to this particular instance and this particular issue, but it's dealing with a member of the public, and this is nothing that they wouldn't have been able to discuss within a public meeting, except that they didn't know that they had to. So again, often violations were attempts by the board to manage district operations. So this is a perfect example, and it actually speaks to one of the earlier violations. This is from Trustee Brashatsky to Ms. Kate in July 2017. And they're discussing kind of a back and forth discussion. But one of the things that Trustee Rashatsky mentioned at length, or mentioned here, and it was something that was brought up several times throughout the communications, was this desire to shorten the length of the board meetings. And he gives her examples of how other similar districts have shorter board meetings. But one of the things that he points out here is that the goal would be to have the board deal less with the implementation of board policy and deal more with actual board policies. And this was something that was a theme throughout a lot of the emails, and you'll see that if you peruse them. This comes from PRA 8, page 1817. And this, and again, this is an example of a Brown Act violation, but in some ways, because the Brown Act can be so confining, you can see very easily here how easy it would be to violate and find yourself in a tenuous situation. So this is an email that's dated January 23rd, 2018. It's from former trustee McDonald to all the members of the board, and this is just the day after they received some information about Ms. Kate going on leave. And this is the day after their regularly scheduled board meeting. So their regularly scheduled board meeting was that Monday, January 22nd. And so here then the next day, they're getting some information about the person who leads the district going on leave. And they're starting to have communications about, well, how do we do this? How do we fix this? How do we run the organization if this is happening? A very reasonable, kind of panicky moment about how do you fix a problem that you're now facing when you know you're not going to have another meeting for 4 weeks. You can find this at PRA 8, 11,092. So with proper guidance, there were some simple corrective actions that the staff and board members could have taken, and I'd like to show you that. I talked to you about one already, where you're blind copying the board members. But also, this is an email. You'll find it at PRA 8, page number 454. It's from Trustee Rashatsky to the entire board, and he's raising a question about the trustee vacancy being posted on the altadena.library.org website. So in this, he's asking several questions. Why is the posting anonymous? He's just asking a lot of questions and concerned about how the posting happened. He's well within his right to have these questions as a board member, and he's well within his right to ask these questions of the staff. One of the ways, though, however, in the future, the corrective action that could have been taken that would have kept this from being a Brown Act violation was that that email should have been sent directly to the director of the library district and not to the entire board. In some ways, it could have been an attempt to be more collaborative, to share information, but the reality is it should have been sent to, at this point, the director, the acting director was Ryan, Mr. Roy. And so if he had sent it directly to Ryan, then this next email that Ryan sends, presumably the same day, but I can't see that, is in response. And he answers all of his questions. He does his research, he answers his questions, but he sends it to the entire board. So the reality is, simple corrective measures, if he had sent, Trustee Rashatsky had sent it directly to Ryan, and then Ryan would have responded directly to Trustee Rashatsky, no violation. The entire board could have been kept in the loop by the director's updates that were published. I'm not sure if they still are, but they were published as part of the board packages when Ms. Kate was a director. So if that's a continued practice, then that's one of the ways to keep the board updated in a collective way versus in these one-off conversations that facilitate inadvertent Brown Act violations. That concludes my report. Again, I'm open to answering whatever questions I'm able to answer as they come up during public comment.
What I'd like to do is just take a I'd just like to just recess for 5 minutes and then come back and we'll have the opportunity for public comment on the report, and then Christine will have the opportunity to answer questions that come up.
In order to make public comment about this, do you need to fill out one of these, or will you call on people? How's that process?
Lynn, what do you think, or?
Can we limit
Do
discussion?
you have an opinion about that? About whether we have to go through the formality of people filling out
No.
forms?
Yeah, we're not gonna
Okay.
keep this off.
Okay, so I guess I'll just ask you to raise your hand and I'll call on you.
So the public comment
Can we
cards
limit
filled
the
out are
discussion
no
time?
value?
For this particular part of the meeting, I think that they're not necessary, so.
So just
Okay, so we're adjourned now for 5 minutes and we'll be back
Can you
at
announce the time
5:55.
that you're taking?
Oh, sorry, 5:50?
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I would like to reconvene us at 6:01. And just to reiterate the way this part of the meeting is going to go, we're still on item 4A, and we'll invite public comment at this time for anybody who wishes to speak to this item 4A, which was the presentation that was just given. And again, if you have questions that came up in your mind based on the presentation that you just saw, pose them during your public comment. Christine will keep track of them, and then we'll have an opportunity to have those questions answered afterwards. Granny, are you asking to speak?
Yeah,
Okay.
I just wanted to say thank you very much.
Oh, wait. If you're gonna speak, can we get you a mic and we'll,
I can talk loud enough.
oh, you know what, I think we really want you to have a mic, please.
Also, this is being recorded, right?
Right.
Yeah, for on the
Yeah.
record.
So they can't hear you, actually.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you very much for having this, because even though I did work for lawyers, I was not aware of a lot of the things that were discussed, and it makes me more understanding of what the Brown Act really entails. And I think from listening to just the brief thing she did, it's really challenging and difficult, it seems to me, not to violate it, and people really have to learn as much as they can so they don't in the future. So I want to just thank you very much for this thing we did.
Thank you, Granny. So, just raise your hand if you'd like to come to the podium and make comment. Okay, Renee?
Yeah, in response to my speaker card on this. Thank you, Ms. Woods, for reading the PowerPoint presentation that was made available first to the public this evening. I can't understand why, A, it wasn't made available to the public earlier and to the board. Maybe it was made available to the board, but not to the public. Thank you for attempting to read those emails selected. None of us can at this point unless we go to the website. So perhaps in future, BB&K can take an extra penny or two per report and actually provide the text so it is readable. And then, I don't know about anybody else, I hear a high-pitched spinning sound like a high-pitched whine in the background. 65 years ago, the Ralph M. Brown Act was enacted in this state. 3 generations ago. It's not a new law. It isn't tough to understand. Don't get a majority of members of the board together in any way, shape, or form and discuss anything, okay? Now, the idea of, but new technology, it's so easy. Look at what can happen. Yeah, new technology that's been around forever. And, people like First Amendment Coalition, my good friend, again, another high-pitched whine in the background, the late Richard McKee, who was a professor at PCC, rabid, if you will, Brown Act supporter and fighter for. All these people who understand the idea that technology is not always your friend. Simply put, if you're gonna use an email or technology, use that provided to you by the agency only. And interestingly enough, search your heart, well, not all of you can, search your heart, search your emails, and find back when Director Kate advised you to not use your personal devices, your personal emails, or any sort of personal technology for district business because it was going to be subject to PRA requests based on that California Supreme Court decision. Now, you can sugarcoat it, as your attorney has, but there are myriad Brown Act violations. She pulled a few pages out, and again, most of those pages were produced because you folks wouldn't listen to someone you didn't like, apparently. She wasn't telling you what you wanted to hear. And so your failure to listen has cost the taxpayers a lot of money. So again, simple message. Don't use any technology to communicate amongst yourselves other than that provided by your agency, in this case, the library district. Thank you.
Any other hands of people who would like to, we're still on 4A, so those of you who have signed up for 4B, no worries, we'll have a chance at that as well. Michelle, please.
Well, I really appreciate that we're finally having this discussion, and I think it's educational for all of us. I would just also like to say that I've talked to a few people about this who say that the Brown Act isn't that hard to follow. And like someone who we work with at the county says, even we're so trained in it that if a couple of us are talking about something in the hallway and a third person walks in, we go, uh-oh, and one of us will leave. Just because it is something that public officials are used to, but I think those are probably more, long-term staff kind of people who probably have had the training from the beginning. So even though it's late, I'm really happy to see this discussion taking place because I know that everyone on our library board is way intelligent enough to be able to follow these instructions, from in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Karen.
As long as we're expressing appreciation, I actually would like to express appreciation to Dale and to Renee, who brought to light things that the rest of the community had no window on. And I think it helped us to form our opinions and to understand the seriousness of the difficulties here. So we began to attend the meetings so that we could see for ourselves. And I think that kind of openness is really important. And all due respect to the attorney who did that fine presentation, honestly, the emails that were selected from there, the public records that were shown to us were not the ones that I found so disturbing in the conducting of a library business. It was the ones that were the personal attacks and the orchestrating personal attacks that were so egregious. Thanks for this time.
Thank you, Karen. Jerry.
Just speaking for myself, obviously, the first thing that was read was the review of the Brown Act to ensure that almost all aspects of decision-making process in legislative bodies of local agencies are conducted in public and open to public scrutiny. And just my big frustration in the last year of coming to and dealing with the board is that everything that was done in closed session. The reporting was minimal and only what you felt you had to report. I still don't have an understanding of what happened between Mindy and the board. I don't feel that there has been an open discussion, and this whole thing was not conducted as openly as I would have liked to have done.
Thank you. Mark.
try to kind of go fast, because nobody really asked some specific questions, so for Christine, thank you again, what everyone said. But let me just ask a couple questions that you might be able to respond to. So one is, on page 6, on the first slide, no action or discussion allowed for any item not listed on the agenda except under specific circumstances. So has the board been trained then that if actually we're on item 12B, whatever the item is, if somebody wants to come up and then ask a question of the board members, can the board members respond back to that person? Because at times the answer was no. So if you can clarify that. Then on page 7, the slide that's got the categories of Brown Act violations, you said you could only really answer the number 6 one, which is a little scary. So the question is, the other 5 are somewhat in some litigation possibility with Skip and Dale or something along the lines. But to me, was there never a board action that took place that you reviewed, so if you can answer this question, a board action that took place that you reviewed that was informational only, but then an action took place? Because if there was, and there was a violation, you could say that regardless of the litigation, but just curious about that. And then page 9, PRA request productions, the second one. So did this meeting actually take place? I mean, maybe I missed it still on the website, but was there really an August of 2017 meeting? I would just like to know, and maybe you guys can answer that. And then on page, which would have been at Loma Alta Park, and then I don't know if there's reasons why it was there, but then item 10, on page 10, I'm sorry, the first one, and you kind of re-clarified a little later after you said this, but I wrote down this note in my brain, or on my paper here for my brain, to ask you, under number 5 of the report of the findings, what proper guidance, there were simple corrective actions the staff and the board members could have taken. So I asked, what are they? And you've described a few of them, and you also said, I believe, that you have shared with them what they are. And so if you've missed some of them, of what you shared, could you share that with us, if that's possible? And then on slide 11, page 11, the bottom slide, where it seemed to me, and I think you clarified it, so you might just re-clarify it. So this really wasn't illegal, this email in here. Again, your suggestion is blind copies is the best way to deal with it. So I just wanted to know, was that email illegal? And I believe the answer was no. You might have said it just a little bit later, but I just want to clarify that. And then on the slide of 12, you said that the info was wrong of what Mindy was trying to say. So if you can clarify how a closed session reporting comes out. The issue is, in closed session, I believe the board in closed session can take a kind of a vote, but it is not binding on the board until they come out of a closed session and actually then deliberate, make a motion, and pass something. And so I'm not quite sure where you said it seemed like the info was wrong that she might have given at the time. So if you can re-clarify that so that we can know really how something gets approved outside of a closed session. Which then brings me back to that page 7. And I know my
Mark,
time.
can I just say, your 3 minutes is up, but you have a very organized list of questions, so how many more do you have?
Just one.
Okay, go ahead.
So good. So then back to the 7, page 7, which is the slide. Again, if you can just answer this, were there any improper closed session reporting outs that weren't done? And the real reason I ask is last week at the meeting, there was a closed session, and I left, and coming back, I did not hear if any settlement was done. And I will just tell you honestly, I asked Mindy, and she said she can't answer. So I just don't know if there's an answer. I'm assuming the answer is it's not, but just in case. Thank you for that extra few seconds.
Thank you.
Actually, now I have a question.
Come on up to the mic, Patricia.
Okay, well now Mark made me think of something. How is it that if you BCC, that's okay? What's the difference? I'm just a little curious. Because you're still disseminating the information to the same amount of people, which would constitute 3 or more. So I'm kind of curious how a BCC is okay, but. Well, I would, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, a BCC is actually more underhanded because you're not putting it all out there.
Okay,
But
Patricia,
that's just me.
she'll answer that. You know what I just realized, thank you. I just realized that Kylan specifically asked me to ask each person to say your name, and I didn't do that.
I know everyone in here.
You do,
so
I did too,
it's okay.
that's why I didn't ask,
Good
so.
work.
And just as a reminder, I mean, we all know who we all are, but you don't have to say your name if you don't want to.
I know who you are anyway.
You know where we find when he's anonymous. Any other comments on 4A? Yes, but I just wanted to well, going once, going twice. This is the, okay. So, Christine, you have the floor.
Thank you. So there were, God, I wish I knew, I feel like I'm so techie until it comes to something like that. Okay. So I just want to address some of the direct questions. I'll just respect the fact that Mark's questions were so organized, and I'll start there. So there were a couple of questions, no action on item off of the agenda. So I think his question deals with my list of findings. Oh, no. My list of categories. And so one of the questions was whether or not there were any number 4s, board actions, on an item that was posted as informational. In our review of the records, there was an instance when the board took an action on an item that was listed and posted as informational. And one of the ways to cure that would have been to come back and take an action. I had several conversations with Ryan about that particular item, and it had to do with information related to a materials expenditure. My understanding, though, was that the expenditure was never taken. There was never an action by staff based on that board action, and so there was no activity on the Brown Act violation. So that's the complete answer to your question, but there was a board action on an item that was posted as informational, and that did happen once. There was also a question, so I want to read a section of the Brown Act so that we can get this out of the way. So when there are closed sessions, I think I mentioned before that there are specific subject matters that can be covered in closed sessions, and you can vote on things when you're in closed session. There are times when you vote on something or you do something, and most times, I'm not saying that it's rare, most times when you take an action in closed session, you should come and report it out. There are times when that is exempted. So Government Code Section 54957.1A5, and it's recorded, so take a look again. Government Code Section 54957.1A5 says that any closed session action to appoint, employ, dismiss, accept the resignation of, or otherwise affect the employment status of a public employee must be reported at a public meeting during which the closed session is held. The report must identify the position, the title of the position, but not the names of the persons considered for an employment position. However, a report on a dismissal or non-renewal of an employment contract must be deferred until administrative remedies, if any, are exhausted. There has been, I think one of the questions was frequently about whether or not there was a lack of reporting in the closed session where either performance evaluations or employment statuses or changes in employment statuses were discussed. And so that particular government code section governs the decisions that were made coming out of those closed sessions. And if you read that, then you would understand why there may not have been reporting about it. Did the August 2017 meeting take place? I appreciate that question because it came up a couple of times, or it came up once at the break as well. So, PRA request number 16 was a request for, and if I misspoke earlier, Ms. Katay, seem to misunderstand what I say, or I said it wrong, so I apologize if I said it wrong, so I want to make it really clear. PRA request number 16 was a request for the agenda of a meeting that was held on August 17, 2017 at Loma Alta Park. There was a request for the notice that was posted on the website for that board meeting. There was a request for the minutes of the board meeting, and there was a request for any emails that referred to that board meeting. There were 11 pages of records produced. There was not an agenda, there was not notice or minutes found related to that meeting. There wouldn't be normally, I want to correct that. So, and then I think Mark's follow-up question was, did the meeting take place? My understanding is that that meeting did take place. There was an agenda posted at the Loma Alta Park Community Center where the meeting took. The branch. Thank you. Where at the branch. I was just going to say, I don't know what the Loma Alta Park Community Center is, so I apologize for my lack of information. But there was an agenda posted. There was a notice posted at the branch where the meeting took place. I'm not sure why the meeting didn't take place here. I think my understanding was that this location was closed for, I don't know if it was renovations or, I'm just not sure. Or maybe it was the day of the week. I'm not sure those details. But there was a meeting, to answer your question. And I've not been provided, there's been no record in the district's files, nor have I been provided a copy of the agenda, the notice, or the minutes of that meeting. I have provided all emails that we have located or been provided that relate to that meeting. Page 11. Oh, the email. I'm not sure which email Mark was referring to, but I think the emails that I've tried to make clear are that are not necessarily violations are these emails from Ms. Kate to the board. That is not necessarily a violation of the Brown Act when it's a one-way communication. I think I mentioned that you can have communications one way from staff to the board. And so that's not necessarily a Brown Act violation. What it does do, and what you'll see in the records as you peruse them, what it does do very often is create the opportunity or facilitates an inadvertent violation, because it's very easy for a board member to reply and then start a conversation. And so what's a better practice, and to answer Patricia's question, what's a better practice is to have blind copies so that, and that is usually a staff-generated email. I'm not saying blind copies between board members so they can have all these blind copy conversations. It's an email from staff to provide information to the governing body, and you blind copy as a best practice so that there isn't the opportunity to facilitate a Brown Act violation by a reply all, or by, replying to the senders and starting a conversation amongst the legislative body. So that's why it's a best practice to blind copy. So the email would go, let's say, from a staff person to Betsy, and then all the other board members are blind copied, and then the only person who can reply to that would be Betsy. Or it could be, an email to nobody, right? And then everybody is blind copied, and then everyone is protected from the possibility of facilitating a Brown Act violation.
Christine, can I just add something about that?
Yes.
What another part of our practice is not just to blind copy, but to say at the top of the message section of the email, blind copy. So it's not that you don't know who it's going to. You know everybody who's gotten it. It just means you can't click reply all. That's it.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Betsy. So I understand, is it Karen?
Yes.
Okay, Karen mentioned that the emails selected were not the most disturbing. I just want to be really clear, and I think this was also something that was brought to me at the break. I think it's really important to realize what I'm trying to do. All of these emails and all of their splendor are available to you to review on your own now. What this was an attempt to do was show you and illustrate for you how the Brown Act was violated. This was not an attempt to point fingers or further humiliate anyone involved in this process. This was just a way to illustrate the Brown Act violations that did occur. So But it was really important as the board creates this opportunity for a public hearing, it was really important to us as well as to the board to make sure all of those records were available to you. That's a very unusual step to make 5,000 pages of public records available. And so I just, you know, if anyone is interested, then take a look at what's there. I will say, there was a couple of statements, Michelle? There was a statement that the Brown Act is not hard to follow. I will just offer you the legislative intent as it relates to the Brown Act. I think there's a real understanding that there are pitfalls within the Brown Act. And one of the reasons why the Brown Act is unique from other sunshine laws, especially our Brown Act, it's unique in one way in that it provides an opportunity to cure, because there are so many pitfalls. You don't have an opportunity to cure errors when you have Public Records Act related productions. So when you are complying with the Public Records Act as a law, there's no cure opportunity. When you make a mistake, whoever's requested those records, they can go straight to the courthouse steps and put you on notice and create legal exposure for the entity at that moment. It's not the case with the Brown Act. The legislature specifically wrote into the act an opportunity to cure, because there are so many pitfalls. So I would just beg to disagree that there are lots of Brown Act violations that happen with legislative bodies all over the state all the time. As someone who practices statewide, I can tell you that's the case. I'm litigating Brown Act issues all the time for people we represent and people we don't represent. We go in and do Brown Act investigations all the time for people we represent and people we don't represent. It's a huge body of practice. So it's not that easy to follow. They're not always persons like Mr. Amy and Mr. Grondermeyer who are calling attention to the issues, but there are Brown Act violations happening all over. And that's why the legislature wrote into the act the opportunity to cure before someone can sue you as it relates to your violation. There's been a couple of misstatements as it relates to the San Jose case, and I just want to clarify that. The San Jose case says that any public employee's communication about official business is subject to the Public Records Act, regardless of the device or the account that transmits the communication. The case does not say that electeds and public employees have to use their district or public provided email or cell phone or device. So there was no violation in and of the fact that the trustees were using their personal email accounts. It's not best practice, because it's very hard to get those records when a Public Records Act request is generated. There's been lots of, this just passed March 2nd, 2017. I know the date because it changed my life. So it's been lots of litigation, even practice since the case, about what happens when a board member leaves the board. How do you get those records once they're gone? There's lots of litigation that is going to clarify this case for years to come. This case is far ahead of technology, right? It's very hard to get text messages out of cell phones. So this case is, there's going to be just lots of litigation about this case for a long time to come, but I wanted to be really clear that the use of your personal email accounts in and of itself is not a violation of this case.
Betsy or Christine, can I just, a point of information on not quite answering one part?
Was there a question you had that wasn't quite answered?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so back on page 6, and it's just a clarification for the board, for this board and the board going forward. So under the third bullet of the first frame,
Can I see your page 6?
brief review of the Brown Act.
Thank you.
No, it's not there. So only so the question under the third bullet, no action or discussion allowed for any item not listed on the agenda, except under specific circumstances. So when something's on the agenda, this was
Yes,
my point.
I'm sorry,
and
I
think
remember
you
your
forgot
question.
that. So an item comes out, they're talking about the report that the children's librarian makes, and so a question gets asked to a board member or the staff person from the public, right, that's speaking on that item. Sometimes you know, the answer might be, or the response might be, we're not gonna answer that question now, or something like that. But the Board of Trustees do have the right to have an interaction with the public person asking the questions if they choose that they wanna do that, right? It's not against a violation.
So, one of the things though, remember when you deal with it, I'm gonna say this in the spirit of the act, remember, because the act is a floor, it's not a ceiling. So, the goal of the act is to make sure there is open participation by the public in all meetings. And if you start to have too much of a conversation or a discussion about an item that's not on the agenda.
I'm talking about something on the agenda. I'm talking the opposite of what that says there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
There have been things on the agenda that the trustees did not then want to respond to in the comments back and forth. That's what I'm saying. With the idea saying that they're not allowed to talk about it for some reason.
They're prohibited.
But they can. They're not, they're allowed to have an interaction with somebody at the podium on an item on the agenda,
That's part of
Nothing
the discussion.
precludes that, but it would be at their discretion.
in their discretion, yes.
Sorry, I didn't understand your question
Right,
the
that's
second
what I
time
wanted
you
to
asked
clarify.
it.
Thank you.
Okay. There were other questions, oh, I'm sorry, one more thing I wanted to make clear, and I wanna make this as clear as possible, and I'm not speaking out of turn because the comment I'm getting ready to make is available in the records. I don't have the site specifically, and I apologize, but in a January 2018 email that former trustee McDonald sent, he was really clear, and this goes back to intent, not that intent matters, I'm not using intent as an excuse, but the intent was, or his understanding of the Brown Act, and this was based on the advice he had been given by prior counsel, was that, and the way that he interpreted that advice, I'm not sure what the advice was, but I'm just speaking to his interpretation. It's the January 2018 email, and it's on the website, and he speaks to the fact that his understanding is that they are allowed to deliberate as a body as long as they are not discussing something that is up for decision or up for action. And that is where the confusion, I think, started to, although we've not taken the time or spent the resources to look prior to these requests, but it looks as if, because it didn't just start, it looks as if there was lots of communication like this amongst the board, but there was an understanding or an interpretation of what was told to him that those communications were allowed because they weren't discussing an action item, something that the board was going to take action on. There was a question about how you plan an agenda in light of these provisions. I thought it was a great question, so I just want to present it. Bodies do several different things. They have a standing committee that is an agenda planning committee in which they have a meeting, maybe, God forbid, after this meeting, but if the meetings are shorter, maybe you could do that. But you have an open meeting where everyone can have a comment and see how they're planning the agenda. Some groups decide to do that, and they notice it, and then there's minutes, and ultimately there's an agenda. You could just empower the president of the board. There's lots of committees, legislative bodies that do this. They empower the president of the board to create the agenda with the staff person. And then at the end of each meeting, there's an opportunity for the public to present things they'd like to see on the next agenda. And then the committee accepts and adopts the agenda, which I think you do normally. And so there's an adoption of the agenda, and there's also an opportunity to change the agenda, and it also gives the public an opportunity to place things on the agenda. There's lots of facilitation of that, and there's lots of examples of ways to do that. I just want to make one final statement, because this was never, I made it really clear this was not my intent. And when I made the comment about the San Jose case, and my comment, I tried to be very precise about my wording, was that the board had not been completely briefed on the impact of the ruling from March 2017. It was brought to my attention that it looked as if I was saying the staff had not done their job to brief the board properly. I was not party to whatever briefings happened between the staff and the board. That was not my intention to give any indication about what the staff did or did not do. My intention in this report is to just present the facts as they were presented in the documents that we had. There isn't an indication of any training that's taken place for the board as it relates to the retention, the destruction, the maintenance of their personal devices or their personal email accounts. And so, and a lot of that has to do maybe with the fact that that law is changing and developing and growing since March 2017 with different cases and findings. But it was never my intention to imply that the staff didn't do whatever due diligence they needed to do when that case came out. It's just to say that the board clearly didn't have an understanding because they weren't operating with the case in mind. So I think I answered all of the questions that were posed unless there's more.
Just one quick one.
Betsy?
It's okay, but.
Okay.
Because you stressed how important intent is and how people didn't intend to do this or that. And on the overview of the alleged violations on page 8, it was looking for all emails that former trustee McDonald permanently deleted from his district trash folder or on or after. So in fact, I guess they weren't permanently deleted, but wasn't his intent, since he deleted them, that nobody else would see them?
I've never met former trustee McDonald in person. I don't know what his intent was, so I can't speak to that. I know that they were retrievable, and we produced them. So I can't speak to his intent, only he can speak to what he intended. What I can say, though, is that I've tried to make it really clear, my goal here is not to focus necessarily on intent as an excuse. My goal here is to focus on intent as a way to, because you have an opportunity now to understand what happened and then move forward. So I think it's really important to understand what the intentions were as it appears in the records, but only for the purpose of moving forward, not necessarily because it has any legal relevance at all. And as an attorney, I can only tell you what's legally relevant, and the intent as to whether or not they intended to violate the Brown Act is not relevant at all.
Well, moving forward for the public, gaining trust is really important.
Yes.
That's why I asked that
Yeah.
question.
I agree with that.
I don't want to get into a big old back and forth. I'm going to allow Renee one question if you have a question.
Thank you.
Is it,
Yeah,
and make sure it's a question if
It's
you
a
don't mind.
speak to an issue you raised and that she
What's
just
the
raised as
question?
well. Under the Brown Act, as you're aware, there are criminal charges possible. It is a misdemeanor to willfully violate the Brown Act in an attempt to keep information secret from members of the public. You have discussed the August 17th, 2017 meeting. You've come up with some rationales for why the meeting might have been held at a remote location. You haven't addressed the intent of that meeting and the fact that if it
Mr.
was
what's your question?
indeed held with the intent of keeping that information secret, that there is a misdemeanor there. Do you believe that meeting violation can indeed be cured and corrected based on your information at hand? So there's a violation. Can it be cured and corrected, or is it more likely to see a misdemeanor charge?
I'm not going to speak too much into that particular violation because it is the subject of litigation. What I will say is that that violation occurred more than a year ago, and so it is outside the statute of limitations as it relates to Brown Act violations. Well, not all Brown Act violations.
Criminal.
I don't know that I understand your question completely, but as it relates to that particular action, I don't know what the intent was, and I don't know what the actions were or were not, because there weren't any minutes. So I can't speak to what exactly happened at that meeting.
Thank you.
Okay?
Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to 4B, which is a resolution that was posted on the website and is in our packet. We have 3 requests for comment.
Make it a fourth.
I'll pencil you
Why
in,
not?
Mark.
What does he say?
Renee, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I've talked with a lot of people in town who wonder why this resolution is here, and I do as well, because I don't understand, as I say, I don't understand why this meeting was held tonight without any explanation to the public at the last regular meeting that this meeting would exist. Again, really glad to see so many people turning out. So, it's been mentioned repeatedly, litigation, Brown Act violations, illegal conduct by the board, a judge who will likely at some point look at what has been done by this board in a court of law and make a ruling and then order some correction, let us say. Depending on whether or not there are actual criminal violations of the Brown Act, that may include jail time for some certain members of this board. But when it comes to those 99 violations that Mr. Gronemeyer and his associates have found as a result of public records requests that have cost so much money because it's taken so much time and effort to retrieve them from those personal email accounts, when it comes to the train just left the track. Sorry. Well, it did too. But that wasn't the end of my time, so pardon me. Oh, there we go. The judge in the courtroom, the 99. The judge will look at what BB&K, Mr. Duran and his associates will say, and their arguments and their attempt to polish things up, and he'll look at what Mr. Gronemeyer and his client have to say and the records, and he will make a decision, he or she. And he or she will say, you know what? You got to do the following. You got to have an audit of all this and a clear accounting to the public, such as was just held, polished. And you got to have a resolution to agree that you're never going to do this again, and that you're going to get training, and that will be the penalty. That's very typical in these situations. Now, when a resolution comes along, you folks can write all the preamble stuff you want any way you want. You can make it look like the former director was awful. You can make it look like only as a result of recent staff activity has any of this come to light. But the basic issue that a judge is going to look at is whether or not you've taken corrective action. So people have asked me, why are they doing this? It's because their attorneys know that a judge is going to require it of them, of you folks. So if you vote this down tonight, which I seriously don't think you will, expect that a judge will order this of you as a result of litigation, that you agree to no longer violate the law in future, and that you get the damn training on these issues. Thank you very much.
Bridget.
I don't know. I get so upset at these meetings. First of all, the idea even that there is such a resolution is appalling to me. Because it's a frickin' law. You don't need a resolution to obey a written law. All we need is a promise that you will read the damn law and obey it. And to add a resolution, to me, well, I just find it insulting. Second point is, I have held out hope for a year. I no longer will hold my breath. My hope has always been that those people on this board who violated the Brown Act would offer a public apology. That's all I would love to see as a resolution, is a public apology for having knowingly violated the Brown Act.
Thank you, Bridget. Mark.
Mark Mearscout. So a little different than the last two speakers. I'll say that I think this is a promise. The resolution carries forward to the next Board of Trustees and continues going forward. So there is that, and I would expect that it would be a 4-0 vote, not a 3-0 abstention or a 2 abstention. I would hope it's a 4-0. The only thing is this is the resolution for the Ralph M. Brown Act, and I just want to say that there probably needs to be a resolution for the Public Records Act, and I'll just say that I think it was around January 17th of 2017 when I submitted a public record request because of a discussion I had with John McDonnell about something after a board meeting, and it just kind of frustrated me somehow, and I just thought I needed to find the answer, and he wasn't probably going to give it to me. And I put a public record request in. January 17th of 2017, 2 days before, probably 2 months later, we find out there were a bunch of records deleted. I only share that because as part of the entire investigation that's gone on, I was actually interviewed. I was told I could say I was interviewed. This is the first time I'm saying this to anybody, except some of you might know it. But I was interviewed by someone that I think BBK, I'm sorry, Christine, but you know, Ruben hired to investigate a violation of what might have been confidential information. And so I got called down to an office in Pasadena, and I gave my testimony. I don't know where any of that result is, because I don't know if that's part of this, and maybe it's still ongoing. I don't know that. But I am saying publicly that I was part of that process, which I thought was good that the investigation was taking place. It was something that the board had talked briefly about, I think, coming out of a closed session, or there was going to be some investigation. And I'm just going to let the public know, an investigation has been ongoing, and I was part of it. But I would say that the Public Record Act, the reason I say it about a resolution is, I can't remember, maybe Kylie will tell you, it took, it went way past the 10 days, and then I think it went way past the extra 14 days, I don't know what the law is, but I didn't get any response, you know, because then all of a sudden, Mindy's not working, so poor Ryan got thrown into this thing, and Ryan just said, Mark, I'm looking for the records, I can't find, you know, we can't find them all yet. It's kind of what he said, right? And then all the rest of this stuff has happened since. So again, I would think a resolution going forward for the new board, you might consider on a public record request that you really try to stick to the 10 days or whatever the response is, and then the 14 days after that. I just share that because I think it's important when a PRA comes in, you try to respond as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Jason.
Jason Capel, incoming board member. First of all, I just wanted to appreciate that, you know, despite all of the issues and concerns around tonight's meeting and this resolution, as an incoming board member, I would like to appreciate that we are here doing this. It would have been very easy for the board to simply punt this down the road, however long. I did want to ask the current board to just consider a couple of things related to the recommendation of the resolution. I would like to see it amended to require the more detailed, longer training immediately of the new board, as opposed to doing the refreshers and then a longer training a year from now. And the second piece that I would ask us to consider is to actually write these requirements into an amended bylaws. I'm not personally sure on the accountability and the implementation of a resolution versus in the bylaws, but what I do know is it would be easier to find it in the bylaws versus a record of a resolution being passed. So I'll just leave that with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Okay. So I will read this resolution, just so we all know what it says, and then we'll move forward with the rest of this. agenda item, Altadena Library District Resolution number 201812. A resolution of the Board of Trustees of the Altadena Library District regarding its continued commitment to compliance with the Ralph M. Brown Act. Whereas the Ralph M. Brown Act, the Act, enacted in 1953, requires that legislative bodies in this state must act and deliberate openly, including city councils, school boards, and boards of trustees of special districts. And whereas on October 9th, 1926, a petition was filed with the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors seeking to form the Altadena Library District. And whereas the Altadena Library District Board of Trustees, the Board of Trustees acknowledges that it is and has always been a legislative body governed by the Act and remains committed to conducting its business in accordance with the Act. And whereas during the gathering of documents in response to several requests for public records, the Board of Trustees became aware that the inclusion of a majority of its members on various email communications likely constituted serial meetings in violation of the Act. And whereas despite these apparent violations, the Board of Trustees asserts that it has substantially complied with the Act in all of its actions as the governing body of the Altadena Library District. And whereas the Board of Trustees acknowledges that it could benefit from continuous training and guidance on how to conduct its official duties within the provisions of the Act, now therefore let it be resolved that the Altadena Library District Board of Trustees hereby declares that it will cease and desist and will not repeat the past actions of the legislative body that violate the Act, including but not limited to email communications that include a majority of members of the board. Resolved further that the Altadena Library District Board of Trustees commits to participating in monthly trainings on the Act for the next year and annual trainings each year thereafter. Passed, approved, and adopted by the governing Board of Trustees of the Altadena Library District, Los Angeles County, State of California, this 3rd day of December 2018 by the following vote. So I think what I do now is to ask for a motion to adopt this resolution, and then we'll have time for discussion of it. So may I have a motion that we adopt this resolution?
I so move that we adopt this resolution.
So it's moved by Gwen. May I have a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. There'll be time for any of us who wish to speak at this part of the meeting to speak to the resolution. In response to Jason's comments, we did talk about whether to add the longer training for the entire board in this resolution. And Christine, can you remind me why it's not there?
So I just mentioned to Jason that part of it was to make sure that this resolution really focused on the existing board and that any new board orientation that Kylan is planning, I should she's planning it, but that's not really a part of the ongoing training. Like new board members, as they come on, will have to go through training for the Brown Act, for AB 1234, through a lot of orientation. And so the idea was that's separate and apart from this overarching commitment about ongoing and continuous training. That was the thing.
So the full Brown Act training is and should be part of the onboarding of new board members anyway, which is about to happen. So that was the rationale for not including it in this resolution. I would favor the idea of including this into the bylaws, because I think you're right, the bylaws is a living document that we refer to all the time, and we have been in the process of updating them, and I think that would be a great addition, because it's like your guidebook that you go back to when you're trying to remember what you decided, and a resolution would get buried in minutes of a meeting and not necessarily be something that that a future board member who's not even here yet, because they haven't, come on yet, would not necessarily know. So Christine, can I ask you, because I'm not sure, if we were to decide to amend this resolution, how would we do it?
You can, if that was something you guys discussed and wanted to do, you can accept an amendment, a friendly amendment, and agree to language, and if you document it with resolution, can be changed and amended before it's signed and attested to.
Okay. So I guess I would like to ask for discussion about that idea, that we add the provision that this, that the requirements that we are now putting ourselves under about training be also reflected in our bylaws.
Well, I think that should be the case, although I'd like to see it maybe a little better defined at some point about exactly what the periodic trainings will be. I don't know if you've talked about that already, about what the 15 or 20-minute session each month is going to be. And also this sort of implies, I think, a little bit that what we already do isn't quite enough. And Kylie, I know I got my required training when I came on board. Does that speak to the annual training thereafter? Is that what was in mind on this?
So, the only required trainings which are legally required are the ethics training and the sexual harassment prevention training. As it stands right now, there's nothing in the law or the bylaws that state that the board has to get Brown Act training. I don't know, I believe that BB&K is the one that is planning to conduct these trainings or refreshers. So I wasn't involved in that discussion, but we have been in discussion for the more expansive Brown Act training happening at an orientation that would happen annually, which we still haven't completely gone over and discussed. So, yeah, I mean, there's nothing right now that says that the board has to get Brown Act
Okay, then,
training.
I thought that what I took was required when I came on back in May.
I did send, or I did provide you guys with that California Special Districts Association link, and I know that you guys did take that, but it wasn't a required thing. I mean, it's helpful, obviously, but no, the only requirements are the ethics and the sexual harassment prevention.
Well, I think then just the general, I support the idea of having that in our bylaws in some sort of maybe non-specific way, that we all commit to getting this training in whatever rhythm we talked about tonight.
As I recall, I think it is in the bylaws. It's not very specific. You can't hear me?
You need
Can't
to be on
record
the
it
mic
either.
for the recording.
I believe in the bylaws, there is a little small section in there that talks about the Brown Act. I'm not sure what page it is, but I do recall going over some portions of that. But yes, we do need that, the Brown Act, and I believe that when I came on the board, I believe I did have to go through the training a couple of times, and maybe once a year, I'm not really sure now. But I believe it does speak to the Brown Act, but we might need to add some other portions to it to make sure that everybody does it. And I would like to know, the recommendation is that the staff and the Board of Trustees do participate in monthly training of the Brown Act for the next year, and especially having new people to come onto the board. How this 10 to 15 minute Brown Act Refresher Act will work, I'm not certain, but hopefully it'll be at a setting such as this, and everyone.
So let me clarify, because
Can
this is
participate.
something Christine and I have discussed, that we're talking about kind of two
Different things?
different things
Okay.
as far as the annual training and the monthly training. And the idea of the monthly training is just for the next year to have
Okay.
on our regular agenda every month
Okay,
an agendized Brown Act refresher
perfect.
that deals with a different aspect of it, or some nuance of it, or
Okay.
some scenarios, or something that gives us the opportunity. There may have been things that have happened over the course of that month that bring up Brown Act questions among
Perfect.
us, because it's a living law that we're learning the nuances of all the time. So and I think it makes sense to me to in the spirit of Jason's suggestion, add a friendly amendment to the resolution speaking to the yearly training. And maybe what we can say is to ensure that yearly Brown Act training is included in our bylaws as an annual requirement for every board member, or something like that. I think that the monthly ones is a thing we're doing for the next year, just to kind of, really reboot and make sure that we're starting strong with the new board. So I'm not sure that needs to be included in the resolution. So.
Well, it sort of is already, right? Because it's got that last passage that says that annual trainings each year thereafter.
No, but what we're talking about now is adding something that says to ensure that this requirement is reflected in our bylaws.
Okay, gotcha.
But I thought this is speaking directly to the point that there have been errors that we have made. And so we need to acknowledge that, and I don't mind doing that, so that we can, I believe that, yes, we need to put the, in the document of the bylaws, that we do need to have the training. But I think this speaks to the whole issue of curing some of the things that have happened during the past year or so. At least that's the way I'm reading it, and maybe I'm really wrong.
I think
Okay.
that's the purpose
But
of it.
I think this is speaking directly to the issues of violations that have happened, and so I would be in favor of doing this resolution as it stands here, but when we look at the bylaws, we need to make sure that we add the other information in there, and I think that's would be wonderful. I have no problems with that.
Okay, if I could take a stab at the friendly amendment that I'm going to ask somebody to propose. In the last resolved statement, tell me if you think this will work. Resolved further, Altadena Library District Board of Trustees commits to participating in monthly trainings on the Act for the next year and annual trainings each year thereafter. And, sorry,
Here on that last one.
Christine, can I, or Kylie, one of you can answer this. If I'm adding another phrase, does it need to be another resolved phrase, or can I add something about ensuring that this be included in our bylaws in that same paragraph?
It doesn't, I wasn't following where you were, but it doesn't have to be a separate resolved phrase.
Okay,
If you just want to add it to the end of the existing resolved
Okay.
phrase with clarification, that's fine.
okay. For the next year, and annual trainings each year thereafter, comma, and that annual trainings, the requirement for annual trainings be reflected in our bylaws. Would that- Okay.
Is there anyone that opposes that amendment?
Well, here's a curveball for you, Betsy, and that would be, is there any way to place a date on when the bylaws will be amended, so that we can also take a look
We
at
haven't
those?
amended
I
those bylaws.
don't think we can
Do that.
take that up right now, because
Okay.
it's not on the agenda, but believe me, I think once the new board is seated, that will be close to the top of our agenda.
Can I just ask
say, Betsy, real quick? I know there was a question about the refreshers, and I think it's come up, and I think it was asked or commented that we would be doing the refreshers, and one of the things that we talked about was the fact that, I mean, obviously, if we're here, we can do the refreshers. I think maybe Terry mentioned it, but it's also something, because we're thinking of a 10 or 15-minute refresher, that's something Kylan could do, something that the staff is very capable of doing, so it's not something that just necessarily requires one of your attorneys to do it. Kylan could definitely facilitate that discussion without us being here.
Good to know, thank you. Okay, other comment or anything more on this resolution?
Not for me, no.
Ira, did you want to say? No?
There's a comment later, when can I say them?
This is your chance for comment.
No, no one speaking.
If you can tie it to this resolution, this is. This is the part of the agenda where trustees can speak, so if you can speak now, now is the time.
Speak now. Can I stand? Podium?
Ira, though, it's better if you do it here. Just hold the mic. Otherwise, it looks like you're talking to us, which I don't think
No
you're.
one's gonna turn the podium on. All right, either way, it doesn't matter. Okay, are there any media people here? Curious about that? Their option. So this Brown Act presentation it was addressed and how the Board of Trustees could have communicated better. And what Christine brought out was that there was really no ill intent in the communications. And what I'm going to address now is the ill intent of Mindy's attorneys and some members of the public in their inappropriate personal attacks on the integrity and character of me and other members of the Board of Trustees. When I spoke at the trustees meeting last October, several attendees left the room because they did not want to hear the truth that went against their narrative. Mindy's attorney dropped his document case on the floor and began to push it to make a distracting noise so that I would not be heard. At the end of the meeting, a gentleman in the audience yelled, "Democracy in Altadena." That was not democracy. A board member said, "What a spectacle." I kind of agree with that. So let's see how much respect I get this time. And I'm going to repeat my speech from that last meeting. Should take about 3 or 4 minutes.
I'm going to ask you not to repeat the speech.
You want me to repeat it?
Okay.
Okay, I won't repeat it, but as I can see, there's no respect here. People are leaving. Well, I'm not going to do that anyway. So, over the last year, my name has been dragged through the mud with statements made by Mindy Kate's attorneys who have shown no respect. And these statements have been parroted by the media, certain members of the public at these meetings, and on the internet to get me to resign. I spoke with an acquaintance of mine who's an attorney, and he just couldn't believe that how there were untrue statements about me, cherry-picking sentences and emails, and twisting the truth. One of the people who has left the room on his blog on Nextdoor kind of says exactly what I'm talking about. First, they complain about the high legal fees from Best and Krieger, and it's aware that that person and Mindy's attorneys account for the bulk of these fees. Now, Public Record Act requests can be made all they want, but it's kind of hypocritical when you have Public Record Act requests which run the legal fees up, and then you complain about how high the legal fees are. This gentleman also put on his blog that public records show that Mr. Brzezinski has referred to former library director Mindy Kate as that idiot, and that he was looking forward to the fun of driving her out of the library. He made a formal complaint against Mindy, and I didn't know how else to describe it, but I put for alleged non-physical, non-verbal intimidation towards him because he felt that she looked at him inappropriately from across the room. Now I'll read you what exactly that I wrote and what the public record says. Mindy came out of her office after seeing me, and it happened to be Ryan, talking, and stopped next to us uninvited, did not say anything or ask anything, and she just stood there eavesdropping on our conversation. I could see that Ryan was uncomfortable, and eventually he said to her it was about a certain person who was harassing the patrons. I was uncomfortable, Ryan was as well, and I didn't say anything for Ryan's sake. So that was obviously, as I said, some nonverbal physical intimidation. So after about a minute or two, she left without saying anything, and her posture was saying, "You better not be talking about me." So I'd like to put the comment where I said that idiot Mindy Katay, and I wasn't calling her an idiot, it was more the action that she did. And I'm saying these things because 5,000 documents are going to be up on the website, and there's going to be a lot of misinterpretation, and again, on Nextdoor, there's going to be a lot of attacks again. So why did I say that it was kind of an idiotic thing to do? Why would I write that? Because Mindy sent out a form letter to raise $250,000 in funds for the foundation for a garden infrastructure project for the main library, which was not pre-approved by the Board of Trustees. She sent the letter and wrote about the tax-deductible donation. This letter was sent to Supervisor Catherine Barger's office. Her office does not make tax-deductible donations. So how embarrassing for the library. If you're going to make a request for $250,000, it's appropriate to send out personalized letters. This was an end around to go around the Board of Trustees and embarrass us. How would it look if we voted against the project where the money was already raised? The common thread is that nobody tells Mindy Katay what to do. And my comment about fun had nothing to do with driving Mindy out of the library. It was complete misinterpretation. The truth is that the comment was made tongue-in-cheek to a fellow Board of Trustees member talking about how the next board president was going to interact with her. And then I know they talk about this secret meeting that happened in August of 2017. There was a meeting, it was not secret, and it was posted, and I'm not going to talk about an agenda or minutes because that's something completely different. And contrary to Mindy's attorney's assertion that it was posted after the library was closed, this announcement of the meeting, how could it be posted if the library was closed? That I don't understand. And then in another public statement, he said that we had a secret meeting in September of 2017. No meeting took place at all. Completely untrue statement. Now, if people want to complain that we closed the library for 6 weeks during the renovation, it was a horrible thing to do, that's fine. But don't attack us personally. And then I heard this gentleman that left the room say right here in this community room that before a Board of Trustees meeting, he was hoping that, and he wished for, that the feds would do a no-knock night raid on me, John, and Armando and arrest us. What kind of sick and twisted mind would think like that? Wishing for people's lives and careers to be ruined. That I don't understand. And also there's a narrative that John McDonald resigned, former president of the board, because emails were going to be released. No one ever spoke to John except me. And in confidence, he told me why he resigned. It had nothing to do with emails being released. In fact, he was actually going to resign several days before that Board of Trustees meeting. So there was no connection between emails and his intent to resign. Then, again, it was posted on social media that why was Mindy let go? Because she wouldn't back down from a board hell-bent on breaking the law. That is untrue. Now here's information that not many people have. There were 2 mediation attempts in September of 2017 between me, Mindy, and a mediator to try to get everything on an even keel. We were doing our fiduciary duty as trustees to hold her accountable for what she promised to do in the mediation sessions and in her feedback from her annual review. Holding a subordinate accountable for their actions is not harassment. It is doing your fiduciary duty as a trustee. And the relationship between the Board of Trustees and Mindy deteriorated many months before last October, no matter how people are spinning it that way. I know part of it was that I wanted to limit the board meetings from 3 to 4 hours down to 60 to 90 minutes. And she took a lot of, she really didn't like that. Her first words out of her mouth was, "That's illegal." And it's not. As long as you have public comment and meet the requirements, it is not illegal. And she said, "I won't be able to do my job." Well, once a month meeting, I don't understand that. Then in July of 2017, I wanted to have a meeting with her and happened to be over July 4th weekend. And she said, "No, I don't want to meet with you. I'm having a 4-day holiday." It's a great, wonderful. That was on a Wednesday before July 4th weekend, a year and a half ago. That Thursday, I get an ASAP, an email. She needed these things done ASAP by Wednesday, July 5th. What happened to the holiday? So I'm supposed to get together with board members where I can't supposedly have these serial meetings and do these things. And then she finally admitted, oh, it wasn't really ASAP. So this is what we were dealing with before October of 2017. Wasn't starting in October of 2017. And there was a retreat, July 29th, 2017. And it was supposed to be about the three boards working together, the foundation board, the trustees, and the friends. And it turns out Mindy decided to make it a fundraising retreat on her own. And John Armando Zambrano, actually changed his vacation schedule because he wanted to be there for that retreat. And when we found out it was a fundraising retreat, we were quite astonished, actually, that it was. And I know that this gentleman who left the room talks about how, in fact, the last board meeting, he said that this issue is costing the library donations. And really, he's the only one that keeps saying and writing negative things about the Board of Trustees and the staff. So it's actually him that's costing the library donations and goodwill to the community. He also said, and this was quite insulting to hear him say this, that there was no one competent to take Mindy's place. What an insult to Ryan, Stella, and the department heads of this library. The staff of this library is there's no other library staff that's as wonderful as the staff here. The library has done very well in Mindy's absence, and she's not the only person in the world of libraries who can run a library. Mark Mariscal, you here?
Yes.
You're not untouched. How are you?
Can you wrap it up, please? Can you start to wrap it up, please?
Yeah. Mark, I won't be very specific here, but there are many things you said about me that aren't true.
Ira, I'm
Yes.
going to ask you not to address it.
Right. Couple of other things, and I'll wrap it up. In my presentation back in October, I had mentioned that talking about limiting the meetings, there were 60 to 90-minute meetings from many different libraries in the area: Sierra Madre, Pasadena, Palos Verdes, and Mindy's attorney said that the Pasadena City Council has 3 to 4 hour-long meetings. And I said, well, you know, I didn't tell them this at the time, but they have a library commission. And the library commission is the one that meets 60 to 90 minutes, not the council. I was also called, and I'll finish up in 2 minutes here. He also called me a racist and a misogynist, which I was, anybody knows me, my integrity, and how I lead my life, that's not even close. And supposedly it's because I allegedly voted for a certain person in the 2016 presidential election. Now, the only person who knows who I actually voted for is me. Well, he would like to do some litigation against us, and I probably won't get into that, but I will say that he seems to be out for his attorney's fees more than the benefit of his clients. I thank you for your time, for listening to me, and I just wanted to kind of straighten things out and see where we can go. Thank you.
Betsy, before you move forward, can I ask Christine a question about the amendment to the resolution? So they don't need to bring it back to the next meeting, they can vote to amend it, we can amend it, and then they can sign back anytime. Okay.
I just wanted to say a couple of things about the resolution and insofar as it relates to the presentation. My own Brown Act training so far includes a publication I asked for from Kylan when I first was appointed. There is a bit of Brown Act in the required ethics training that Kylan mentioned, and then Terry and I also did I think we all actually did an online webinar about the Brown Act. And then Terry and I also went to a downtown session that was provided by the Board of Supervisors. And what I have learned is never think you really know it cold. I learned some things from Christine's presentation that, that the nuances of the Brown Act and the different kinds of situations that you need to apply it to are myriad. And it's just not a natural way to do business. That's what makes it really hard. We've talked about transparency and communication, and it's really hard to just not, pick up the phone and call somebody or dash off an email. It is very hard, and to Michelle's comment, I bet it was seasoned, career public servants who do know this stuff cold, but, volunteers who come onto a board, the learning curve is daunting.
Yes.
As a lot of you know, I had immediate questions about the way my own appointment happened, and I raised those questions, and former trustee McDonald and our former council, responded immediately, and I feel like I had my questions answered. So I do hope that one thing that we can do going forward is to, not only, commit to these trainings, but to a vigilance, so that when we realize, they're gonna be, it's possible that Brown Act violations inadvertently will still happen. As Christine spoke about it's very, very common, but another thing I think we need to really watch is for opportunities to catch ourselves and for opportunities to cure things as we go along, so that things don't take such a long time to resolve. Sorry, I need to put my glasses on, my own handwriting. Yeah, if you don't live it every day like we do, trust us, it's hard. So my hope is that these ongoing trainings will serve to just keep the whole issue at the top of our minds, to really explore the nuances, and also to help the staff and the public understand. I hope, and it sounds like this session
It's helpful.
increased understanding in this room. And I'm glad, because I think if nothing else, you can spot us. And also, I hope that gives you an appreciation of how complicated it is, and so that we're all kind of on the same page about the challenges that presents. So my hope now is that, that we all understand a little bit better what went wrong, that we understand the conditions that cause those things, that we commit to keeping ourselves updated, and again, that we correct and cure if necessary as we go. So that's what I wanted to say about the Brown Act. Are we prepared to vote on this resolution? And, I do have to say one thing. I feel anguish to hear, that passing this resolution is insulting.
Could I have a minute?
I'm so sorry to hear that. No, I'm sorry. It is with the most sincere hope. So, I just had to say that. So,
One of the things that I think that we tend to forget, Altadena is a wonderful place to live. There's a civility, and we somehow have forgotten that we're neighbors. We're neighbors. And some of the things that have been said have been just quite inappropriate, disrespectful, and I'm hoping that we can get to another place where we need to be. The community needs us. We need people in the community to do the work. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And I'm just saying that because sometimes you get sort of fed up with it. You hear it, and you just need to respond to some of this because it's just unfair. So unfair. So Betsy, I understand where you're coming from, and I hope everybody in here understands where I'm coming from. I've lived in this community since 1968. I've used this library when I was teaching. I came to get videos, films, whatever they had that I could use in my classroom. My children and my grandchildren have used this library. This has been a wonderful resource, not just for folks that don't have, for others too. And I think we forget where we are. So I've said my piece, but thank you so much for listening, because it gets to be a little bit on the rough side sometimes. And I don't think that we really want to make everybody feel uncomfortable. I really don't think we want that. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Betsy.
I guess I do want to say one more thing, which most of you know, that I'm a professional librarian. And you won't find a more, a fiercer and more determined club that protects the rights of free speech than librarians are. And so, I might beg it to differ just a tiny, tiny bit with what you just said, which is if we do have free speech and we all sit in this room and we listen to each other, sometimes we are going to be uncomfortable because we're not going to agree. And you know, everybody does have a right to say. Everybody has a right to say.
Absolutely.
So I'm grateful to all of you who gave us your thoughts tonight. And that you come to our deliberations. I do want to say one more time to thank Ira Brashansky for his service to this library. He has been a patron of this library for
Years.
longer than some of us, certainly longer than me, in this room, and I hope that he continues to feel comfortable to come here and use the library, and I hope that if you see him, you will greet him warmly. If Armando was here, I would say the same to him, and I'll say it in his absence, that as Gwen said, we're neighbors and we're volunteers. So when people step forward to try to make a difference and do the best they can, and I honestly believe we're all doing the best we can, I think we should do the best we can to be as kind as we can. So with that, I think we're clear on the wording of our...
Yeah, but there's no, I don't have a motion or second
for the amendment. Okay, can someone please move to accept the amendment?
I'll agree to make the addition to that motion.
Okay.
Thank you.
And a second
Amendment.
to that amendment?
I'll second that.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are going to now vote on the amended resolution. I think we're clear on it, right? I don't think
I
we
wonder if you could just read it back, the last part.
Just the last part, okay. Kylan, maybe, I wrote it down, so if you need me to, I can read my version and we'll see if they match.
Okay. So the last resolved, further Alpena Library District Board of Trustees commits to participating in monthly trainings on the act for the next year and annual trainings each year thereafter, and that the requirement for annual trainings be reflected in the bylaws.
That's what I had to.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll now take a vote. All those in favor of this resolution, please say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. No opposed, no abstentions, thank you. I'd like to now ask for a motion to adjourn.
I'll so move that we adjourn.
Okay, it's been moved. Can I have a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded, and we adjourn this meeting at 7:29.